And now we will share the screen so we could look at the, wait a second, that's weird. Okay, hopefully you can see the screen in front of you. And we are studying, the last section of this week's Torah portion, that being the section of the Akedah, very, very essential part of Jewish faith, the story of the Akedah, the binding of Isaac. All right, so let's learn a little bit. And maybe, but maybe, because the verse right before the Akedah is so profound, or the two verses before that, let's learn that as well. In verse number 33 of chapter 21, the verse states, Vayita Eshel beve'er Sheva. Avraham planted an Eshel in Be'er Sheva. Vayikra Sham b'shem Hashem Keil Olam. And he called there in the name of the Lord, the God of the world. What is this verse telling us? This, you can say, is at a peaceful point in the life of Abraham. He just formed a covenant with Avimelech and now settled down, and now he opens up an Eshel, which Rashi explains. What is an Eshel? Both explanations given by Rashi lead to some sort of hospitality. So Rashi says, Rav and Shmuel disagree. One says Eshel is an orchard. Pardes. Very appropriate that we read this Rashi, because we've been calling this the Pardes class. So one opinion says it was a Pardes, which means an orchard. And the purpose of the orchard, says Rashi, was lahavi mimenu peiros, to bring fruit, la'orchim baseuda, to the guests who wanted to eat. V'chad amar pundak. Some say it was a pundak. What's a pundak? Pundak is like a little inn, a little bed and breakfast, which had all sorts of food. So whether the Eshel is the orchard which provides fruit, or it's an inn which provided food and shelter, point is, Abraham set up a place where people can come and be taken care of. But the next words are equally important. Vayikra Sham b'shem Hashem Keil Olam. And he called out there in the name of God, the God of the world. And here's where Rashi tells us something. You may have come across this idea before, but this is the source of it. And that is how Abraham would invite people into his home, and he would feed them. Beersheba is a very hot place still today. Beersheba is a very hot city. And you can imagine how happy people were to find refuge and good food in the middle of the desert. Abraham would feed them. Then at the end of the meal, Abraham would say, all right, now that you ate, enjoyed a meal, it's time to bench. And so some of them would say, all right, I'm comfortable thanking God for the food. Others would say, that's not my thing. I don't really believe in that. Some of you who joined me last night are familiar, that's not I don't believe in that God thing. So you can go ahead and do it on your own, but it's not my thing. At which point Avraham would say, all right, if you don't want to bench, then here's a bill for the meal. And he would present the bill, and it would be a rather expensive bill because it was a meal in the middle of a desert, right? You know the way it is. In some places, suddenly food costs 4 times as much. Try buying a sandwich in the airport. So he said, the prices here is in the middle of the desert, and so therefore, it's quite expensive. And the guest would say, whoa, I wasn't expecting a bill. So Avram says, you don't have to pay the bill. You could bench, and you won't pay the bill. And then they would bench. And that's why the pasuk says Vayikra, but the Gemara says Al Tikra Vayikra Ela Vayakri. Vayakri means causes others to call out. Vayikra Sham Hashem Hashem Kol Olam. He called out in the name of God. That means I called out in the name of God. Vayakri means he caused others to acknowledge the name of Hashem. And the difference between Vayikra and Vayakri is very significant, and it's very practical. You know, as someone who hosts people in my home all the time, Vayikra is relatively easy. Vayakri is a lot harder. Again, Vayikra means calling out in the name of God. Vayakri, which the Talmud says you should read this word as Vayakri, he caused others to call out. That's a much more challenging task. If you host people in your home and you want to say a Dvar Torah, you're going to say an inspirational word of Torah, that's great. It's very nice. People may enjoy it, but that's Vayikra. Vayakri challenges me to cause someone else sitting at my table to acknowledge the Creator, who perhaps wasn't going to say the grace after meals to say the grace after meals. It could be very uncomfortable. It could be very uncomfortable really pushing someone else to make a blessing when they weren't intending to do so. It's much easier to just be the one to say it out loud and let others hear. But Avram did not suffice by announcing his beliefs in Hashem or sharing Dvar Torahs. Avram felt it incumbent upon him that if someone's at my table, I have to somehow get them to bless God's name or to acknowledge the presence of God. Now one can ask, what's the value of forcing someone to thank Hashem? What's the value in that? How is that a righteous act? The fact that you twist someone's arm to say, you know, I believe in God, why is that of value? So there's one answer which is generally given. Today I want to give a different answer, which is given in the there's several Hasidic answers. The first answer, which is most commonly given, and I'll just say it in a few seconds, is that we believe that deep within everyone's system there is already a belief mechanism, and when you force someone to say it, it is actually their neshama expressing themselves. So when someone says a blessing, even if they seem to have been forced into it, but really it is the expression of their neshama when they do thank Hashem. But another idea, which is brought down, is as follows. In the Tanya, chapter 29 of Tanya, shares a very profound Zohar, quote from the Zohar. And the quote from the Zohar was, A'a de la solik be nahora mevachinle. A log of wood, which is not kindling. You have a big log of wood. This past summer, we took a family trip a few hours north, and one of the highlights was trying to create a bonfire. It's not as simple as it sounds. The first night we were not successful. The second night we figured it out. But the point is, if you have a log of wood, which is difficult to kindle, what should you do? It says the Zohar, mivachimle. You have to smash the log into splinters, splinter it into small pieces, and then it'll catch fire. It says the Zohar continues, Gufa, telo, solik bei nahora, a body. And there's a human being who, for whatever reason, let's say most personally, talking about myself, when I sense that somehow the light of my neshama, my coarse body is not being kindled by the light of the neshama, what should I do? Mivachinle, one should crush the body that is not being kindled by the light of the neshama. Even though this is not the feel-good message we often hear when it comes to kindling and neshama, we always talk about just do goodness and it's always being kindled. The Zohar and the Tanya brings it down. Sometimes, in order to allow ourselves to be kindled by the light of the neshama, we have to break ourselves. We have to break our animalistic selves, that is. Somehow, when a person walks around with the cocky attitude that I have everything and everything is perfect and I am perfect, it's going to be very difficult to allow the neshama to kindle such a person. But with such a person, the Zohar says, if you break a person to some degree, not entirely, but break down their animal to some level, then the light of the neshama will take hold. So the Rabbi Nesicha says this was what Avram was trying to accomplish. He had these people in his house. He believed that there was the light of the neshama within them. Every human being, and this is before the difference that existed between Jews and non-Jews, every human being has the light of God within them. And he says it's there. So then what's stopping these people from benching? It's the coarseness of their animal side. They've become so self-absorbed that they refuse to acknowledge something greater than them. And therefore, even though I've been speaking about the presence of God, that doesn't affect them. For some people, it did affect them. For some people, all that was necessary was for Moshe Rabbeinu to speak about the presence of God, and we have to be thankful, and that was enough. For those who it wasn't, he says, okay, now I need to break them a little bit. How did he break them? By presenting them with a very expensive bill. When a person comes face to says, now I have to pay Abraham, $200 for this meal, there's a certain brokenness there. I wasn't expecting this. This is hard for me. I don't want to give this money away, but I have to. I don't have a choice because he fed me and he has every right to collect this money. So that was a humbling experience. When someone has to pay something they don't want to pay and they're forced to, there's a certain humbling experience there. And Abraham said, I need to break their animalistic side. And this action of saying you have to pay or bench was a form of breaking them. And when you break a person, sometimes the key to revealing the neshama is to break the body. So the Rabbi says that was the goal of Abraham's actions, is that even though Abraham represents kindness, and generally that's what him and Sarah were. They were kind, they were generous, they were hospitable. But sometimes in order to bring out the neshama of a person has to break themselves. And Abraham was able to Abraham had the ability also to see which people needed a little bit of a humbling moment in order to break their animal side to allow the light of the neshama to shine through. So that's how the Rabbi explains this process that Abraham did. Okay, now let's move on. We have a few more minutes. Let's move on to the seventh aliyah, which begins with this section of the Torah, which is so important that we repeat it every single day. It's part of the daily prayers, the Akedah, the binding of Isaac. This is widely considered to be the 10th test of Abraham. The 10 tests of Abraham. And you see certain similarities between the first test and the 10th test. The first test, at least according to many, which according to some, the first test recorded in the Torah was the beginning of last week's Torah portion, which began with the words Lech Lecha. Here too, in this test, God says to Abraham, Lech Lecha, verse number 2. It says, take your son, your only son whom you love, the Lech Lecha, and go. So, let's read the first couple verses. Verse chapter 22, verse number 1. It was after these things, after the events that previously took place. And God tests Abraham. And here the Torah very clearly tells us God tested him. And Abraham was tested 10 times. But I think this is the only time about which it states clearly that God tested Abraham. God tested Abraham. Vayomer Elav, and he says to him, Abraham, Vayomer, and he says, here I am. Vayomer. Verse number 2, and he says, Kachna es binchas yichitcha, take your son, your only son, Asher ahavta, which you love, as Yitzchak. V'lech lecha al eretz Moriah, and take him to the land of Moriah, v'ha'alehu sham la'ola, and bring him there as an offering, al achad ha'harim, on one of the mountains, Asher Omer Elecha, which I will tell you. And here's the other similarity between the first and the last test. And that here too, God doesn't tell him exactly where he's going. He just says, go, and I will show you when to stop. Similar to what he said in last week's Torah portion of Lech Lecha. Go, and I'll tell you when to stop. Okay. The Torah then goes on to describe the story. I'm going to assume you know this story, so I'm not going to read through it. Obviously, if you don't know the story, I encourage you to read through it. But there's so much, there's a lot to share about this. Let me share one very interesting Talmudic concept that I just came across today. And that is from Tractate Smachot. One of the called the minor tractates of the Talmud. So the Tractate Smachot, chapter 8, says as follows. Gives an analogy and talks about 4 different people who God tested. Says the Medrash, says the Talmud, in the name of Rabbi Akiva, that there was a king who had 4 sons, and he struck each one of them. He struck his 4 sons, and each one, and there were 4 different responses. One son remained silent. One son complained that it's not fair. A third son asked for mercy. And the 4th son asked his father to hit him again. Says Rabbi Akiva, we find all 4 examples in Jewish history, in biblical Jewish history. And now, before I continue, does anyone here want to try to guess any of the 4 sons? Again, the king was hitting 4 sons. One son silently accepted. One son complained. One son asked for mercy. And one son said, hit me again. Anyone want to check in over here and try to answer this, to try to give your shot at explaining this medrash? Anyone here? I don't know who you're talking to. All right. Okay. I guess I'm going to have to just give the answer. So here's what the Gemara. This is what Rabbi Akiva then continues to explain. The son who accepted without any hesitation, but it was one who accepted silently without complaining. That's a reference to Avraham. And that's a reference to this section of the Torah, in which Avraham received a strike, a very painful strike, to take your son as a sacrifice, and he woke up and followed God's command. Even though he had a very reasonable argument to make against it. He had every right to say, God, you promised me that this son is going to be my future. But nonetheless, he was silent and accepted the strike from Hashem. The child who complained that it is unfair, that's a reference to Job. Even though it's hard for us to find any fault in Job, especially since the pain that Job experienced was not just the potential loss of a child, but the actual loss of many children, 7 children. But Eov questioned God. He complained that it's not fair. Again, it's hard to judge Eov negatively. In fact, Eov is also seen as a great man of faith, but nonetheless, he does complain for his pain. The one who asks for mercy, the child who is struck and asks for mercy, that's a reference to Chizkiah, King Chizkiah, who is told by Yeshaya, by the prophet Yeshaya, Hinchames, you're going to die for your actions. The Talmud gets into why that is. You're going to die for your actions. And Chizkiah complains and says, "Takadosh Baruch Hu, don't." And he not complains. I'm sorry. He asks for mercy. It says Yeshayahu says to him, "You're going to die," and he tells Yeshayahu, "You have to leave the room because I'm going to pray. I don't trust. Even you don't have the right to determine that I'm certainly going to die." Instead, he turns to God and he asks for mercy, and God grants mercy. And perhaps most fascinating of all, the one who is struck and then asks God to strike him again is a reference to King David. King David was struck. In fact, let's see if I can pull up the text over here from Sepharia. King David is struck, as the pasuk says, Tehillim, chapter 51. Shenemar Herev kapseini me'avoina umechatasi tahareini. King David says to God, I ask of you to please give me the pain which will help cleanse me from my sins. So David HaMelech not only accepted the pain in life that he had to deal with, and David dealt with a lot of pain. He lost a child. He was threatened to be killed by numerous family members. But David accepted the pain that he went through, and even asked of God to give him to cleanse his sins with more painful experiences. And those are the 4 responses we have, and I think all 4, even Eov, all 4 are righteous. Certainly, David HaMelech was righteous, Chizkiah was righteous, Abraham was righteous, but even Eov, who complained, we then see that he accepts the divine will, which is fascinating. All 4 are children of Hashem. All 4, God was acting with love to them, even as he had to strike them. And all 4 were different responses, which I think are all warranted in our relationship with Hashem. All right, with that, we'll stop here. And I look forward to continuing our Torah studies next week with the Parsha of Vayera.